Brother, sister, loving your neighbor was never meant to mean having no boundaries with your neighbor. Scripture calls believers to genuine hospitality, to real love for the people living right around us. And that command hasn't changed. But hospitality was never meant to mean unlimited access to your home, your family, and your peace, regardless of how that access is actually being used. Some neighbor relationships genuinely enrich a household. Others quietly drain it, one small, unaddressed pattern at a time. Today we're naming 6 kinds of neighbor behavior you should never simply let into your home unchecked. No matter how long you've lived beside each other, or how awkward it feels to finally name the pattern. This isn't about becoming cold or unfriendly toward the people around you. It's about recognizing the difference between genuine neighborly love and a pattern that's quietly taking advantage of your openness. Stay with me. If you've lived in the same neighborhood for any real length of time, you've probably encountered at least one of these. Think about your own current or past neighbors honestly. Is there someone specific already coming to mind as you hear this list described? Someone whose visits leave you feeling subtly drained rather than genuinely refreshed? That instinct is worth paying attention to, even before we name the specific pattern involved. Because your own sense of depletion, after certain interactions, is often more reliable information than you tend to give it credit for. The first pattern you should never simply let into your home is the chronic borrower. Someone who asks for things, tools, money, favors, again and again, and rarely if ever actually returns or reciprocates what's been given. This often starts innocently, a genuinely reasonable request between neighbors helping each other out. But when the pattern repeats without any actual reciprocity, when borrowed items quietly become permanently gone, when the relationship becomes entirely one-directional, that's worth naming, rather than simply continuing to absorb. Genuine neighborly generosity flows both directions over time. A relationship that only flows one way isn't actually friendship. It's simply an unaddressed imbalance dressed up as neighborliness. Consider how this pattern actually functions over time, even when each individual request seems small and reasonable on its own. A ladder borrowed and never returned. Cash, just until Friday, that quietly becomes a permanent, unspoken gift. Each instance alone might genuinely be nothing worth mentioning. But the accumulated pattern reveals something the individual instances don't. A relationship where one side has simply learned that asking works, and the other side has simply learned to keep absorbing the cost without ever actually naming it. The second pattern is the gossip. Someone who turns casual visits and friendly conversation into information gathering about your family, your finances, or your private life. This person often seems genuinely warm and interested at first, asking thoughtful-sounding questions, remembering small details about your life. But notice where that information eventually surfaces. Repeated to other neighbors, reshaped and embellished along the way, sometimes coming back to you secondhand in a version you barely recognize. Genuine friendship protects what's shared in confidence. A neighbor who consistently treats your private life as material for wider conversation isn't actually building genuine relationship with you. They're simply mining it. Notice the specific quality of the questions this particular neighbor tends to ask, compared to genuine curiosity. Genuine friends ask about your life because they actually care how you're doing. This particular pattern asks in a way that feels slightly probing, slightly too interested in specifics that don't actually concern them. Finances, marital tension, private family matters, details that exist purely to be redistributed elsewhere rather than genuinely held with care. The third pattern is the boundary violator, someone who shows up unannounced regularly, ignores clear signals that it's not a good time, and generally treats your home as an extension of their own. A little spontaneity between close neighbors is genuinely part of healthy community, but a pattern of disregarding stated boundaries, arriving during dinner despite being asked to call first, letting themselves into spaces you haven't invited them into, staying long after clear signals that a visit has run its course, reveals something more troubling than simple friendliness. Genuine respect for a household includes genuine respect for its actual boundaries, not just an assumption of open access whenever it happens to be convenient. Consider how differently this same behavior lands depending on whether an actual boundary has ever been clearly stated. If you've never actually told this neighbor that unannounced visits during dinner aren't welcome, their behavior might simply reflect a genuine lack of awareness rather than deliberate disregard. But once a boundary has been clearly and kindly communicated, continued disregard for, it stops being an innocent oversight and starts being a genuine pattern worth addressing directly, rather than quietly continuing to tolerate. The fourth pattern is the conflict bringer, someone who repeatedly drags neighborhood drama or their own personal disputes directly into your home. Every visit somehow becomes an opportunity to relitigate a dispute with another neighbor, air a grievance about someone else on the street, or recruit you into taking sides in a conflict that was never actually yours to begin with. Your home was never meant to become the staging ground for someone else's unresolved conflicts. A neighbor who consistently brings this pattern into your space is quietly asking you to carry weight that genuinely isn't yours to carry. Notice how draining this pattern actually becomes over time, even when each individual conversation feels like ordinary neighborhood catching up in the moment. You end up carrying detailed knowledge of conflicts that have nothing to do with you, quietly pressured to take a side in disputes where you genuinely have no stake, and your home becomes associated, in your own mind, with tension rather than peace, simply because this particular pattern keeps bringing that tension directly through your front door. The fifth pattern is the disrespecter of your family, someone who undermines your parenting decisions, contradicts household rules, or speaks disparagingly about your marriage, all while inside your own home. This might look like openly disagreeing with a rule you've set for your own children in front of them, or making comments about your spouse that quietly chip away at the respect your family deserves within its own walls. Whatever this person's intentions, allowing this pattern to continue unaddressed teaches your own household that your home's actual authority and values are negotiable, subject to whoever happens to be visiting that day. Consider what your own children specifically absorb from watching this pattern unfold repeatedly, even if no one ever explicitly discusses it afterward. A rule quietly undermined in front of them, again and again, by the same visiting neighbor, teaches them something about whose authority actually holds weight in their own home. Protecting your household's internal authority from this kind of quiet erosion isn't about being rigid or unwelcoming. It's about ensuring your own children can trust the consistency of the home they're actually being raised in. And the sixth, maybe the easiest to miss because it's the quietest. The user, someone who's genuinely warm and present only when they need something specific from you, and largely absent the rest of the time. Friendly and engaged the moment a favor is needed. Distant, unavailable, or simply nowhere to be found the rest of the time, including during seasons when you could have genuinely used their support. This pattern can take years to fully recognize, precisely because the warmth during the moments of need feels completely genuine in the moment it's happening. But genuine friendship shows up consistently, not merely transactionally. A simple, honest test can help clarify this pattern over time. Think back through the last year and ask specifically who reached out to you during a genuinely difficult season, not just who reached out when they needed something from you. The answer to that question often reveals, more clearly than anything else, which neighbor relationships are actually mutual and which ones have simply been quietly transactional the entire time, however warm they've genuinely felt in each individual moment of need. So what does it actually look like to practice genuine neighborly love while still protecting your home from these 6 patterns? It looks like generosity that expects genuine reciprocity over time, not an endlessly one-directional relationship. It looks like guarding what's shared with you in confidence and noticing who consistently fails to do the same. It looks like clear, consistently held boundaries around your own home and time. It looks like declining to let your household become a staging ground for someone else's conflicts. It looks like protecting your family's authority and respect within your own walls. And it looks like noticing the difference between genuine friendship and a purely transactional relationship dressed up as one. None of this means becoming suspicious of every person on your street, or withdrawing from genuine neighborly community out of excessive caution. Most neighbor relationships are exactly what they appear to be: ordinary, imperfect, genuinely good. But a home that's regularly examined for these 6 patterns tends to stay a place of genuine peace, rather than one quietly worn down by relationships that were never actually reciprocal to begin with. Here's a simple diagnostic for each of these 6 patterns, if you want somewhere concrete to start examining your own neighbor relationships honestly. For the chronic borrower, can you name specific items or amounts of money currently unreturned? And has the relationship ever genuinely flowed in the other direction? For the gossip, have you ever heard your own private information repeated back to you secondhand, reshaped by having passed through this particular neighbor first? For the boundary violator, have you actually stated a clear boundary? And if so, has it been genuinely respected afterward? For the conflict bringer, how much of your recent conversation with this neighbor has actually involved someone else's dispute rather than your own genuine relationship? For the disrespecter of your family, have you noticed your own children's respect for household rules softening after repeated exposure to this particular neighbor's undermining comments? For the user, who showed up for you during your own hardest recent season, and does this neighbor's name actually appear on that list? None of these questions are meant to turn ordinary neighborhood life into a constant, exhausting audit of every relationship on your street. Most neighbors, most of the time, are exactly what they appear to be: imperfect people doing their best to live well alongside you, deserving genuine warmth and generosity rather than suspicion. The goal isn't paranoia. It's simply honest pattern recognition, applied specifically to the handful of relationships that have actually shown a consistent, repeating pattern rather than an occasional, forgivable lapse. Consider how differently a neighborhood functions when these 6 patterns are actually named and addressed, compared to one where they simply accumulate silently for years. In the first, genuine boundaries create space for genuine warmth to flourish, precisely because no one relationship is quietly draining the household while everyone pretends not to notice. In the second, resentment slowly accumulates beneath a surface of forced friendliness, until an entire neighborhood relationship curdles into something neither side ever consciously chose, but both sides somehow ended up trapped inside. Scripture's call to love your neighbor was never meant to require the absence of any discernment about how that love actually gets extended. Jesus himself modeled both radical hospitality and clear, firm boundaries, depending on what a given relationship or situation genuinely called for. Loving your neighbor well sometimes means generous, open-handed welcome. It sometimes means a kind but clear boundary, firmly held. Wisdom is knowing which one a specific relationship and a specific pattern actually requires, and having the courage to act on that wisdom rather than simply defaulting to whatever feels most comfortable to avoid an awkward conversation. If this stirred something in you, brother, sister, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to Biblical Warning now, and let's keep examining these hidden places together, one warning at a time.